the SEBI case.
Hindenburg versus SEBI chief saga.
Another bombshell from Hindenburg.
Involving Madhvi Puri Butch, who is the chairperson of the Securities and Exchange Board of India.
So why do you think that these allegations were made?
The target is not the target, but the intention is that the bullet should go through her and hit somebody.
Allegations are more of a personal attack on Mrs. Butch and her husband.
And then pass through that person and hit somebody else. Not tomorrow, if one of my friends is going to take a position, he or she will worry about what the position will expose. Will their background as private sector people be examined in public?
Welcome everyone to another episode of The Overcorrection. Today we are in studio with Mr. Vivek Joshi. He is the author of the book Startup to Scale Up. He is also a business strategist. He writes prolifically on geopolitical events, public sector style of working and private sector style of working. Where does this friction come from?
Within the public sector and the government, there is a feeling that private sector people make a lot of money. Jindagi bhar paisa to tumne bana liya. Now you are coming into these plum positions. You people are thinking only about profits. IAS is also called I am Sarvasva. So I am everything. So even within the public sector or the government, there is resentment towards the IAS. The area which private sector people will almost never see are the risk which public sector people take.
The ECI actually, the places they have gone to make sure like 5 people can vote. Not lazy guys.
There used to be a saying in the Royal Air Force, there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old bold pilots because they go down in flames. The same is true of the bureaucracy. There are old bureaucrats, there are bold bureaucrats, but there are no old bold bureaucrats because...
Welcome everyone to another episode of The Overcorrection. Today we are in studio with Mr. Vivek Joshi. He is the author of the book Startup to Scale Up, an entrepreneur's guide to venture capital. He is also a business strategist. He writes prolifically on geopolitical events. And first thing I want to say is, Mr. Joshi, thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rohan. Great to be here and talking to your audience.
So, Mr. Joshi wrote an article called The Empire Strikes Back. Love the name, by the way. It is about the allegations made against the SEBI chief recently. We are going to get into these allegations and discuss the backdrop of this whole event. But before that, I wanted to start with a line from the article, which I'm going to read out, which discusses the broader impact of these allegations being made. So, reading from the article, it is disconcerting to see professionals used as scapegoats by entities pursuing their political and other interests. It makes private sector managers think multiple times before taking jobs that involve nation building in the public sector. The system needs to learn from developed countries like the United States in the matter of benefiting from private sector competencies. So, now we all want to build our nation. We will discuss the strong patriotic ties you have. You moved back from the US here to benefit our country over, say, benefiting private organizations based in the US. You obviously care a lot.
Yes, I do.
Why is it important that we get private sector talent in our country? And what is it particularly maybe about Indian bureaucracy that you feel needs this?
There is an enormous amount of talent in the private sector with international experience, functional experience, a different way of looking at things and a different way of approaching things. There are certain advantages that the private sector has. There are certain advantages that the public sector people bring to the table.
Okay.
And that's how the thali is going to get completed more. And in the US, there's a lot of movement between academia, industry, and government. And in India, that seems to be getting stymied. Why the private sector? Having spent most of my life in the private sector now, the private sector person is more result oriented, is more direct, looks at a task and looks at finishing the task and reaching an end point. They are much more focused. Now, it's not that our bureaucrats are not capable. The IAS is a very good service, some of the best talent in the country.
One of the toughest examinations to crack. So obviously very bright people who are joining.
Yes. So very bright people who joined, they are smart, they are competent. But there are certain features about the bureaucracy, and for that I'll give you an example of from the Second World War. During the Blitzkrieg, when the Germans were bombing Britain, there used to be a saying in the Royal Air Force that there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old bold pilots because they go down in flames. The same is true of the bureaucracy. There are old bureaucrats, there are bold bureaucrats, but there are no old bold bureaucrats. And therefore, bureaucrats tend to be risk-averse people, which invariably affects their ability to be innovative. Private sector people can also, being result-oriented, tend to be much more innovative in these things. So there are certain things we bring to the table.
Interesting, because actually, we read a lot about how even on the corporate side, India has less creative tendencies than US in terms of its risk-taking entrepreneurially. We tend to be a risk-averse culture in general, even on the private side. Would you say that compared to the US?
I would split risk-averse and entrepreneurial a little differently.
Okay.
Yes, we are risk-averse because in the country, particularly for private sector people, there are no social security nets. So there is risk has certain severe consequences even in the private sector. In terms of entrepreneurship, it is said that India is a very entrepreneurial country, but I would like to put a caveat there. A lot of our entrepreneurship is what would be called livelihood entrepreneurship. The person is an entrepreneur and doing things because he or she doesn't have anything else to do. Of the 60 million enterprises in the country, almost 95% remain small, micro or small, enough to feed one person, and that's all.
Not the startup
no.
Journey we all imagine.
This is like Sachin Tendulkar. Sachin Tendulkar played cricket in the gullies in Dadar. Doesn't mean that everybody who plays cricket in the gullies in Dadar is going to succeed. That's something which we need to keep in mind when we say India is very entrepreneurial. But there are great examples of private sector people contributing in the public sector. One of the first ones is Nandan Nilekani, UIDAI.
Of course.
Now he could have, like me, he is also from IIT Bombay, though of course much more senior. He had everything. He could have relaxed and had a good time. But he still went around and delivered something which is transformational in this country.
Yeah, and also one of these global innovations. People are looking to it in other countries. In fact, there are India is now going and helping out other countries, I think in Africa somewhere, set up a UPI-like infrastructure for them.
We are helping some European countries do it.
Oh, wow.
Leave aside Africa. It's quite possible that if Nandan Nilekani had been in the government, he wouldn't have come up with something which was so dramatic. Essentially, these are some of the things which private sector people can bring in. More of risk taking, particularly if you're senior, you are relatively settled in life, etc. You can do out of the box thinking, out of the box deliveries. You can take initiatives. You have a different way of looking at things. So it's important that this talent and this experience be absorbed in the country and put to good use. People in private sector retire at 60 and 65 and they're in good health. Many of them would like to contribute. So there is enthusiasm there, and there are competencies there, there's experience there, and we should use it.
Okay, so on that front, now maybe we can talk about the SEBI case. Your article, which we will link to in the description of this video, gives a very in-depth analysis of the legal accusations made and whether they hold merit, and you should check this entire article out yourself. So why do you think that these allegations were made? what is the backdrop of it, and then what made you sort of come out and want to write this article and put your thought out there?
See, allegations wise, in today's India, it is very easy to make allegations. We have good laws on defamation, but very poor implementation. So, normally I would not have cared because allegations are aired. I mean, they are there all the time. In this case, my feeling was that the target is not the target, but the intention is that the bullet should go through her and hit somebody and then pass through that person and hit somebody else. Now, that is not fair to a private sector person. You can say that there were certain gaps in doing things because we have had a history and a lifetime of doing things a little differently. So perhaps things were done differently, but the allegations to that extent were, I believed, were unfair. Now, the second part of it was that these allegations were also targeting a family member, which is not fair because if I am to sacrifice my opportunity cost of earning money elsewhere and work for the government or the public sector, I don't expect my children and family members also to make sacrifices and sit at home. So that is not fair.
Yeah, you mentioned in your article, like, it would be good to go back and see if there's any record of IAS people who have taken these positions. Have their spouses been ever asked to stop working a field in which they have 35 years experience?
Yes, I have asked, and I'm sure that they have not been asked, and it is correct that they should not be asked. In fact, IAS officers and other officers would disclose their assets to the government internally and in confidence, which I believe has also been done in this case.
Yes.
Now, there is no need, everybody is entitled to privacy. There is no need to have disclosed the assets out in public. Again, if there was something substantive, there's a case on in the Supreme Court. People could have gone and to the Supreme Court and tried to revive that matter. But just to allege things on the person, on the family member, put out their photographs in the media picks it up, I felt was unfair. But this is not, it's not a matter of individuals. Not tomorrow, if one of my friends is going to take a position, he or she will worry about what the position will expose him to from the political side. Is it going to be that they will be targeted due to the political interests of somebody that when they are not in politics? Will their background as private sector people be examined in public? And their background will be judged from the light of how public sector people have their backgrounds. And the two are quite different.
Exactly. I mean, all these connections that any high-level person in the private sector has built over 30 years, they are going to have connections to other high-level people in the private sector.
Right.
In fact, it is these connections that make you want them for that job, in the sense they know how these people work. They are the right ones to be controlling and managing them.
So yes, they will have connections. In fact, networking and connections is one of the success factors in the private sector.
They'll teach it to you in an MBA and then penalize you for it 10 years later.
So I thought that if politics had not come into it and it had remained into more people had been analyzing what had happened, and perhaps in future the onboarding of private sector people in public sector how can that be improved?
Okay.
Then it would have been positive. That the onboarding should be like this. Maybe the private sector person must disclose these things. But then to target somebody out of political interests.
And with such malice, because actually if you in the Lokpal, when they put out their statement on it, these allegations were supposed to be made completely privately, but they were leaked to the media, and it was because of that the Lokpal had to come out and give out all their findings, so at least everyone has a clear picture. So clearly a level of nefariousness here.
Nefariousness on the part of some people, There are some people who are genuinely concerned.
Okay.
As I talk to various people in the private sector, they say that the concerned individual or individual should have done ABC more.
of course.
Fair point. There's always room to improve. But trying to score different ends is something which I found unacceptable.
So on this note, around this case, there's been a lot of talk about the difference between public sector style of working and private sector style of working. This case in particular, a lot of details have come out about friction between the two styles of working. Let's start with where does this friction come from? You mentioned about result-oriented nature of people working in corporate jobs versus, say, people in government jobs. We'd spoken briefly earlier about government jobs being a lot about security, which is where the risk-averse nature probably comes from. So how do you think this friction is created, and how can it be abated?
See, we need to look at the public sector in different buckets.
Okay.
On top of the heap is IAS. IAS is also called I am Sarvasva.
Sarvasva.
So I am everything. So even within the public sector or the government, there is resentment towards the IAS. The feeling is that the IAS tends to get the cream of the postings, and it's a closed circle and lobby which prevents other people from, even within the government, from coming in. One part of this is a natural friction that had this position not been taken by a private sector individual, I would have got it. Now that is human, that happens everywhere. Natural feeling, not only in the IS, it could be IRS or anybody else. It can be within the private sector. Look, I should have got that opening. So to that extent, it is understandable. It is human. So a resentment which comes from that point. The second one which comes towards the private sector people is that जिंदगी भर पैसा तो तुमने बना लिया, अब आए हो, now you are coming into these plum positions.
You've heard this, like from people who have expressed this?
Yes. Yeah. That within the public sector and the government, there is a feeling that private sector people make a lot of money. To some extent, it is true. However, these days, government and public sector positions also carry reasonable perks.
In the last 10 years, there have been quite significant jumps. For example, private sector people hardly get any pensions. Public sector, you get inflation-adjusted pensions. But so that resentment, that you have made your money also and you're coming in laterally. Number 3, what might happen is because the person is coming in with a higher, what we call cost to company, CTC, packages sometimes, and in fact often, are worked out differently for them than they are for government people coming directly. Okay, that's interesting.
There is that can cause certain amount of resentment. Then the feeling amongst public sector people that someone coming from private sector cannot see the full picture. You people are thinking only about profits, or you're thinking only of certain stakeholders. There is certain merit in it because public sector positions address a much larger number of stakeholders than a private sector position does. A good example, early in my career in India, when I came back from the US, I was a project engineer putting up factories. So we were having a course in corporate training course in project engineering. Mumbai was going through concretization of its roads.
Okay.
So a BMC engineer came to talk to us about their experience. Initially, as we sat in the audience, we were quite, let me say, we were a little arrogant. This fellow is only making roads and we are making factories. By the time he finished describing the complexities of his project and 65 stakeholders, we were almost wanting to sit under our tables. We don't have to address so many stakeholders. We don't have to take such broad views. So the feeling in public sector people that these their backgrounds are different. They have not been exposed to these things. You are not sensitive to what might happen in terms of the political dimensions of it. आपको वो समझ में नहीं आता है. You'll go away 3 years later. And you'll become a CEO somewhere, or you'll retire somewhere, whereas some people like us have to continue for another 10 years and get our pensions.
So all very valid points.
These are
You can see the point of view for sure.
Yes, certainly. One of the things which has happened in this country is CVC and RTI have brought in a lot of benefits.
Okay.
But the two have spooked the bureaucrats. Bureaucrats have become very afraid of taking decisions because nobody wants the CBI on their doorstep 5 years after retirement. Now, someone comes from the private sector, comes, delivers, takes decisions, goes away 3 years later. Except for the 3-year period, they have no answerability either before or after. So there is that resentment too.
Okay.
But
so what are the steps to bridge these gaps? You'd mentioned about how maybe from this case we can learn that the onboarding would be different. I think that's probably where this bridge has to be made.
One learning is that the onboarding, and in the learning from the specific case is that onboarding with disclosures. A lot of these things would not have come up if the list of disclosures would have been longer, both voluntarily as well as specified by the specific laws. Neither was there. So the onboarding process. Institutions like, I won't take the name, but industry associations also need to realize that there is some contribution, and increasingly private sector people will be contributing. So industry associations need to set up sensitization programs both ways. For the government also, for the public sector also, and for the private sector also. That look, when you are going to go step into it, this is how you think and operate differently. From the government side, it's important that the people who are already in the bureaucracy or public sector do not feel threatened. So, for example, the government has recently had a program of taking in 43 people with advertisements from joint secretary, director, etc. downwards. It should be very clear that this person is never going to become the secretary, who's the top person there.
But would you scare away some of the talent if you told them, hey, you're never going to become the secretary?
It may, but frankly, I don't think any private sector person believes that they will become the secretary. If they have ambitions, the ambition would be from joint secretary, I will go to Minister of State and this. And Mr. Manmohan Singh is like that.
Or perhaps they'll do maybe a 3-4 year stint in the public sector and then return back to private sector as well.
In fact, there are people like that. And one of the things you bring back when you do so, some years back, I was quietly asked if I would like to be an OSD, Officer on Special Duty in a ministry. At that point in time, the disparity in incomes was so great that, and my children were growing up, that I said, I won't be able to meet my EMI expenses out of this. But those who have gone and come back, and one of the things I was told is that you'll develop enormous number of contacts when you work with ministries, etc., which is true. So we had a discussion at home, and my wife said nothing doing. Her standard of living should not go down. So,
I mean, that comes down to it. Like, while salaries have gone up, as we discussed, they're clearly nowhere close to what you would make in the private sector. So it would actually cost people, especially in those years, before you're retired, it would actually require some sacrifice. Schools your kids probably go to, the type of vacations you take, all would change completely.
As a country, that's one of the biggest mistakes we have made when we became independent and developed a bureaucracy, or inherited a bureaucracy, is thinking that the bureaucrat or the government employee will work purely out of patriotism. Now, patriotism is fine for me, but patriotism will not pay for sending my child to study in a university abroad.
Yeah.
So, while Singapore, when
Yes.
Lee Kuan Yew started, they actually paid their bureaucrats more than the private sector. This is a mistake we have made, but that slowly that mistake is getting corrected. The bureaucracy also needs to look at things. The two things which they don't do well. One is they don't have a customer orientation. If they develop something, when we developed something in FMCG, fast moving consumer goods, we used to visit the homes of consumers and see how the consumers use them. I've actually stood by a basin with people brushing and spitting to see how people brush.
Our top FMCG companies
Yeah.
make it a point to do this, where even as you go up in the ranks and as you become senior, you have to do field visits. You have to speak to your direct ground seller and your direct ground consumer.
In India, I went to a village for a consumer visit. There was nothing to sit on. The lady offered me a gunny bag, the gehu ka gunny bag. I sat on it. A dog came and sat next to me. We try to live those experiences. So even if the bureaucrat is delivering a service, how is it being seen? So both the external customer and the internal customer that they need to look at. The second is have clear objectives and deliver to those objectives. Now, they do have reviews, and they have a section in their review which is a confidential review. Private sector these days, at least the good ones, don't have confidential reviews. But they need to have clearly defined time-bound objectives. It's happening in this government, from what I understand, that the movement of files, there are specific deadlines set up in the movement of files. And if the file doesn't move from table A to table B, a flag is raised. The other interesting thing which has happened, which has both its positives and negatives, is particularly in Modi 1, visits of corporates to ministries was actively discouraged.
Interesting.
If you went into a ministry, you would earlier find lots of suits and ties.
All your lobbying.
I will say lobbying is not necessarily bad.
Okay.
Because sometimes you can go and explain your point of view or what you're
Fair.
doing.
This
which
was
you know.
different.
My personal experience in an application, and this happened a couple of times, was that the application is being processed. The bureaucrat is not understanding it. We offer, we'll come to Delhi and explain it to you. The response is, don't come. Send it by email or send it by whatever, and if required, we will call you. And they didn't call. We got the approval, etc. There was nothing else which had to be done.
So they're trying to limit this unnecessary overlap, limit the points
Of contact
where
points
this
and points of overlap which are being restricted. So, if without being political about it, top level corruption in the country has come down. No
Very-
doubt about it.
Very good.
The low level corruption continues. The other important thing for us to realize, and this is more from the point of view of governance, is we have 3 layers of governance: the central government, the state government, and the local government. Most of the touch points for the citizen are with the local and state government.
Okay.
Your policing, electricity, water, healthcare, education, you name it.
You don't deal with the central
You don't
government.
deal with the central government, you deal with the local government. Even if the central government sets up a hospital, it's eventually, most of them are run by the local and state
Okay.
governments. We don't hold our local and, particularly local, we don't hold our local and state governments answerable the way we hold the central government answerable.
And based on what you're saying, we should be holding them more answerable.
We should be holding them more answerable for better delivery. There's no point in cursing the central government for a pothole in a Mumbai road. So there is that's
A bit of the
something-
layers of it,
yeah. So this is from the standpoint of what a private sector person would like to do. By the time we get to the age of 60, 65, etc., there's accumulated experience. Many people are reasonably well settled in life financially. Children are grown up. They are willing to make those contributions. And even like many of them have done 1 rupee per year, a nominal payment. People are not looking for payment. The mechanisms to absorb this input are not in place yet. And one of the best forums for that might be the industry forums, the various industry forums which abound. So
the industry forums on the private side or the public side?
Industry forums on the private side, which are good for collecting this input.
Okay.
But the government needs to be open
there,
to,
or like attend these forums almost.
It happens at very high level. Nandan Nilekani at UIDAI. But why not something in Maharashtra's Mantralaya? Or come down. Have you heard of private sector participation in BMC?
Not at all, yeah.
Surely, I'm sure in health and education are two things which affect everybody. So people would be willing to contribute in these kind of things.
I think I was reading in this book An Uncommon Love about Narayan Murthy, the kind of change. He had to deal a lot with the government, and he actually, as a private sector founder in Infosys, worked with the government to set up these new forms of way to pay the employees.
Yes.
Like he brought ESOPs to India, right? Like that was an unheard of concept, and the government didn't know how to tax someone on ESOPs. So he actually worked with them and helped them structure out a way in which, so I know it wasn't done so formally like it was now. It was sort of his push to get his company running. But look at how it set up our country.
It is making a big difference. ESOPs are now available for public sector.
Everyone has them, like
enterprises also. So it's one thing which, particularly if your audience is younger, is one thing which I would like to, and I tell that to college students often. We live in an age of lot of information overload.
Okay.
There is a continuum in going from, or progression in going from data to information to knowledge to wisdom. Now, we'll leave wisdom out. Many people will not get wisdom in life. Data becomes information when it is organized.
Okay.
But it's important not to reach conclusions on the basis of data or information. You should reach conclusions only when information is converted to knowledge. And when does information convert to knowledge? Is when you add to the information the content, the context, the connections, and the history of that information and the patterns. These 5 things. So if you read something like these allegations in the newspapers or allegations against anybody, an industrialist or a politician, etc., remember one thing, that reach a conclusion only either you have deep expertise in that area, in which case you can straight away reach the conclusion, but most young people will not have deep expertise, or to that information you add these other areas. Because there's a lot of information overload. The media has a lot of commercialization. I have a practice that if I don't watch one news channel, I watch around, within 1 hour, which I devote to news, I watch at least 5 to 6 English news channels, couple of Marathi ones, couple of Hindi ones. If I find a news story of interest, I see at least 3 to 4 different channels on it, and I will tell you, no channel will give you full information.
I've heard, in fact, that you should look at all these different sources, look at the points they all agree on. And those are likely to be the indisputable facts of the case.
Points they agree on is low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
When you read a journalist or when you listen to anything on it, develop the habit of seeing what the journalist has not said. What is not said is as important as what is said.
Fascinating.
And as you read different people, you will find what is not said by A, B, C, D. And therein you get the full story.
And you start understanding the bias more from what is not said rather than what is being said. Very interesting.
Your information becomes complete. Now, it's not as if that the private sector is perfect and the public sector has only gaps.
No. In fact, we spoke. You hinted on so many of the points where private sector people maybe think they know it all because of their tremendous success in a particular way of doing things, but maybe the game is just a little different when you're dealing with the public.
It is. There's a principle in Zen Buddhism. When you don't understand something, ask 5 whys in series and you get closer to the truth. In industrial engineering, this has been adapted in different ways. There are often reasons why things don't happen in the government. Because the government and the public sector in general has a much broader perspective of things and a much more long-term perspective.
Okay.
So if the government is not doing or not able to do something, there are likely to be things which you are not even aware of, which may be happening behind the scenes. So remember that. Number 2 is process. Government works by rules.
Okay.
Private sector works looking at the results and working backwards.
Yeah, fair.
So government has to work by rules.
And they can change their private sector companies can change their approach much faster than a public sector.
Much faster. The government rules often flow from acts and law. And it's sometimes not feasible to change those fairly quickly. And if things are going to affect a lot of people over a longer period of time or a deeper effect, it is better to have work by rules than to take shortcut views. An emergency like COVID is different. You can take shortcuts, but you can't take shortcuts in running a country all through.
Yeah, it's how we look at, like, say, medicine, right? Like, there's all these complaints, these medical journals are so out to date. People always complain, like, there's new research on this. I was like, yeah, there's going to be new research all the time, but they can't just quickly go and reprint what your basic treatment has to be for diseases. Correct. Yeah, this is stuff that they figured out over 50 years is safe, 100 years is safe. 2 years, some clinical trial is showing positive results. We'll change a complete treatment altogether. Who knows what sort of fiasco that may create 10 years down the line.
Exactly. There's a very good book by S.E. Moglu, who just got the Nobel Prize, but this book is written some time back, on why nations fail.
Okay.
And one of his points, and broadly I personally agree with him, is nations don't fail because of just economics or other things. They fail when institutions fail. What are institutions? Institutions are a set of rules and regulations to get things done.
That's it.
So there is, so that's the important. Private sector people don't have such an institutional view, while government sector people have. Similarly, in the government and also in the very large corporates, setting a precedent is a very important thing. If I am an IAS officer and I am going to, let's say, a poor person comes to me, asking for an ambulance to take a relative to the hospital. As a private sector guy, I would do it, I would not do it. I'm anyway not answerable. So let's say I will do it. As an IAS officer, I'll have to worry that, okay, I help this person. The next person comes. What am I going to say? If I start helping each person, do I have the budgets or the vehicles to do it?
Am I going to be called a favoritist because me, without realizing this person was of some particular background?
Yes.
Tomorrow I say no to someone because of some other reason.
I'm in trouble.
You're this type of guy now.
And if I help everybody, I've exceeded my budget for something which is not a budgetary item. So then I'm going to be hauled up for something else.
So, people like to say, like, complain, everyone's lazy, everyone's this, everyone wants that. But, there are things that we don't see which, I'm sure there are 100 examples like this of things that happen to you when you are put in this position of power that maybe with all the good intention in the world, your hands are still tied.
And a third area which private sector people will almost never see are the risk which public sector people take. Imagine having there's a state in India. Internally we had a rule that we will not visit that state because of high crime. As a private sector person, we would fly and go back. As a public sector guy, I have to go into Marxist, Naxal-dominated areas and build a road and stand there and supervise and build a road, risking my life as well as other things. So they and if you talk to doctors who are in government service, they have to go into villages in terrible conditions and do things for
the
people.
ECI, actually, we were talking about it during the general election. The places
Yes.
they have gone to make sure like 5 people can vote. Through Naxal-occupied
Through Naxal-occupied
territories,
areas.
thick, dense jungle, they're chopping polling
Exactly.
booths in.
So they
Not lazy, guys.
not lazy, and you really need to. You may have the government machinery backing you, but you need to be dedicated. You need to be courageous, and you need to have that kind of motivation.
So I think on this note, I want to now move a little to the
Yeah.
personal side of your journey, which we hinted on before. You had a pretty sorted life set up for you in the United States. You had a green card on the table. You could have very well settled there. And at a age where over here you may not have had the house and the car, over there it was all plush. You had decided before going there that you would not settle there.
Yes.
And I think maybe a lot of people feel that way, but then they go there and they see the trinkets, and it's not so easy to give up.
See, yes, I did have a good start I started my first job after my studies in the US, settled down fairly quickly, got a green card through the typical H1 labor cert green card route. I also got what is called a professional engineer, chartered engineer certification in California, which is after 2 exams and some period of experience. I was in who's who in environmental engineering in California. Before I was 30 in California. All those things were in place. But before I went to the US, I was very clear about one thing, that I would come back to India and my contributions in life would be towards betterment of this country. The US is a wonderful country. If ever I was to think of settling anywhere else, I would settle in the US, no doubts about it. But I was clear that my contributions will go here mainly. To some extent, personal events also intervene. The NRI always has that fear of the midnight telephone ringing from India about the parents not being well. That didn't happen in my case. But so when I came back, I was fortunate in the sense that I got a job in an MNC, and a well-run MNC. So that helped. I'd reached a stage in life with a car, an American roommate, a professional success, personal friendships, etc. Another 3 years would have made it difficult to come back. And I was not married by then, so there was no other
one tying you
opinion to
down.
be taken.
You could have been this.
Yeah. And there was no other opinion also to be taken. Practically speaking, those who are married and have children, by the time the children are 5, 6, 7 years, you have to take a call, otherwise it is difficult to come back.
Okay.
So when I came back, I started working near my hometown. For the first 1 year, I could not drive in India. There is, compared to, and I used to be the designated driver of our company during parties, etc. in the US, because I'm a teetotaler and others would drink, I would drive. And I used to enjoy driving.
Yeah. It's lovely over there.
I've driven from Florida to California alone. That's 3,000 miles when I migrated from Florida to California. But in India, I could not drive. But and I was also a little surprised, and so were my parents. The professional settling in was not as difficult as I had thought it might be.
What year was this, the move back?
This would be late 90s. So, and things have obviously improved much more here after
Yeah,
that.
I mean, if back then you're saying it was the roads were trickier than the offices.
And I was talking to a salesperson of a real estate company over the weekend for another purpose, and he was telling me that the number of inquiries they get from NRIs coming back now have increased significantly. People wanting to buy houses, may initially to invest, but also as a provision to come back. One of my close relatives who's doing very well, has a small child, is also thinking of coming back now.
So yeah, so this is like the younger generation.
Younger
Maybe they've spent
generation.
about 10 years there.
We
Yeah,
have spent
even
10 years
I
there.
talked to a lot of my friends who've settled abroad. So I'm about 30, so in that bracket, and they have an amazing life there. Every time I go there, I'm like, wow, this is something amazing that you've built for yourself. You see someone living in London, living in Boston, New York. More and more each time I meet them, they've expressed this idea. Yeah, it's really great, but long term, I think we'll probably want to come back.
One reason is professional, the growth rates of India, and India is now in a sweet spot. We were talking about the 50-year contractive cycle. If you do the contractive for India, 50 and 50 years, we are actually in the 75th year, so middle of the 50-year cycle, second 50-year cycle. So we are in a sweet spot. We are doing well. Growth here is better. So that's one attraction. Second thing which people feel, or which I didn't, is when children are 5, 6, 7 years old, is when that transition comes. It's very difficult to accept that your child, 7-year-old child's school will have a metal detector at the entrance. And a lady I met recently who came back from the US was telling me, and this is shocking, she said her 7-year-old grandson came from school and said that they are being given training in how to understand gunshots. And if they hear a gunshot, what is it that they do? So what they will do is they'll go and hide under their desk, put their handkerchiefs in their mouth, because if there's a loud explosion, you can bite your tongue, and cover their ears. Now, this was something, as a very young child, I was taught as a civilian in the 1971 war, that if bombs came and fell, we used to live close to an airfield, military airfield. If bombs fell, what is it that we do?
Oh my God.
Now, there is a degree of discomfort from in this standpoint also. So and in a sense, and to that extent, I am lucky that my educational background helped me to fit in professionally.
You're an engineer. You're the heart and blood of India.
Yeah, so to that extent, I was lucky. While we were not very rich, parents had a home, so coming back, I didn't have to look for home. I was straight away living in a house. Everyone will not have that, but there's a lot to be done here. There's a lot to be gained here, and it can give you, unless. Okay, let me put it this way. When we were in the US, one of the things, most Indians in the US discuss is, we used to call it X+1 syndrome.
Okay.
1 saal baad wapas jayenge. That X keeps moving. So, and one of the debates which we used to have amongst our Indian circle was, why is India behind? Americans are very smart people, so are we. So why is India behind?
And Indians over there are like outperforming Americans.
Outperforming.
Right. So
one of my senior Indians, who was senior to me, said that, remember one thing, that the average in the US is as good or as bad as the average anywhere else. But the best in the US is the best in the world. And that's the success of that system, that they understand what is best and they nurture it. So if you are going to live in the US, you have to be the best. Then your coming over to the US is worth it, both for yourself and for society and US and India and whatever. But if you are going to be average, then you have not gained much.
do you feel there's this element? I mean, US, UK, super globalized places, but do you still always feel that it'll never feel like home?
the greatness of the US, and I have to grant them this, is that you don't feel like an outsider.
Which city were you in? You were in LA.
I lived in Florida, and then I lived in California, principally near LA. You don't feel that you're an outsider. If you go to other countries, the people are very nice. They're very hospitable. But you will not feel that you are a part of that society.
European countries, essentially.
In the US, you have a chance of feeling a part of society if you wish to.
They'll let you acclimatize, to their way of life.
If you wish to.
They're like French people, like you try speaking French a little badly, they'll pretend they don't understand you at all.
And therefore, while in India, you always have, obviously, if you're born and brought up in India, you will be more at ease in India than you will be in other places. But I would say that if someone wants to live in the US, the country is open enough to give them their avenue. So that there's no other country in the world which is that open. And in another area, US and UK beat every other country, including India. You will not, or it is very rare to find the CEO of a company in Germany who is not a German, and the CEO of a company in India who is not an Indian. Airlines, yes, sometimes temporarily, yes. It is only in the US and UK you will find CEOs of huge companies who are not Americans.
That's very fascinating. I never thought about this, even from like first world European countries.
These two countries are very open about these things. In for other countries, even if they have their subsidiaries in India, the top person is invariably an expat from that country. So there's a lot to be said about the US.
That's fascinating. So just to maybe touch on a bit of global politics before we wrap up. You wrote an article which I found very interesting. I just wanted maybe you to tell the audience a brief about the article, because I want to link that one out too. I know it wasn't part of our discussion points, but it's essentially about India's future, how we are affected by other countries, how other countries may be affected by us. And I just loved the tag where you said that the whole world wants India to succeed, except for two countries, and that's China and Pakistan.
See, if you are looking at a country, and I keep telling that to students and my friends, etc., also, that never try to understand a country without understanding at least its demography and geography.
Okay.
So India, like the US, is blessed geographically in terms of arable land, water, access, etc. Whereas countries like Russia, China,
they have more space but less arable land.
Arable land is one part of it. In terms of hostile conditions is also another part. Hostile land conditions. Russia, for example, is essentially a very insecure country, because it has no natural defenses. Whereas India has, in most of the places, India has natural defenses. What a country needs to have is a grand strategy of where it will be. And finally, India is now talking of that Viksit Bharat in 2047. It's more from the socio-economic standpoint, but the military part of it also and the strategic part also goes hand in hand with it. Big powers have clear grand strategy. Let's see. Everyone curses the Americans for what happened with Native Americans. And yes, they deserve that criticism. I will not deny that. The 13 original states, when they started, they were not expected to survive. They would not have survived. They were facing a hostile power on their seaboard, UK, and behind them were the French on the other side. The greatness of American presidents was to realize this limitation. US became viable when they crossed the Appalachians, if I got the mountain range right, took land from the French and the Mexicans, not American Indians. The French and Mexicans had already taken that land. The US started on its great power journey when they did the Louisiana Purchase and took New Orleans. And the US completed its beginning of great power journey is when they crossed the Rockies and went to the other coast. Look at what Mao did with China. China has always been very vulnerable. Han China, as it is called, is 1/3 of overall China. But it has 5 regions which Mao took around it, including Tibet, securing China. Look at what Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible and Catherine the Great, Ivan, Peter, Catherine, started from Muscovy, vulnerable Muscovy, grew, built buffers around, crossed the Urals, went to the Pacific Ocean. India currently does not touch all of its natural defenses. Ideally, we should have been up to the Indus on the west. But in other places, we are reasonably secure. We have a good demography in terms of numbers, youth profile. We have to improve the quality in terms of skilling, training and health. And clearly, within the constraint of resources, this is recognized and everybody is working towards it. So geography is secure, demography is secure. If we continue to progress on towards Viksit Bharat by 2047, we will have a large economy. Fixed costs will not increase as much. More money will be available for things like defense, health, education, etc. So the economic aspect will get taken care of. Number 4 factor which would make a country great, in my view, is natural resources. Now we are reasonably well endowed, but we don't have things like oil. But in the direction in which we are moving, again, this is the vision that the country has now. Our dependence on oil, etc., will
Is going to
decrease.
go down, yeah.
So again, we are securing ourselves on raw materials.
In energy front also.
90% of our trade is by sea, on water. The Navy is now becoming, as we have seen recently in the Middle East, what happened with the Middle East hijacking and things like that. We had 40 ships out in the Arabian Sea. So we are increasingly in a position to defend our trade routes, and this will keep improving. Number 5 is a determining factor which I call culture.
Okay.
Now, do we have the culture to be a superpower? And here I am not very sure. And I'm talking of superpower in the sense that is understood today, not the spiritual part, etc. In that we can be Vishwaguru, that nobody doubts about.
No, let's talk about the mainstream understanding of a superpower.
So, do we have the culture, do we have the winning mindset? Look at sports, that killer instinct, winner's instinct. In our generation, we didn't. What I'm very happy to see, and I say this when I go to colleges, I find that the young Indian is very confident. The young Indian is not diffident, does not have that inferiority complex, and has the feeling ki bhai, yes, America, you have done very well. You're a great country, but we'll also get there.
Yeah. In fact, we have the co-host of the show, Puru. He works in a US-based company operated out of India, and there was this whole culture of, if sales is being done out of India, it needs to be like they'll change Jaspreet to John. And he says that you still come across clients who are saying, hey, no, we want to speak to an American team. And now Indian companies have the confidence to say, no, sorry, then you can go somewhere else because this is our team.
Yeah.
And we're willing to take a risk on things like bottom line, which is where everyone has a good talk until it hits your actual numbers. And so I think this is probably reflective of the same type of cultural shift you're talking about.
That, yes, as an Indian, I can and eventually I will also win. I'm not second to anyone. It's not predestined that I will lose. The younger generation now has this confidence. Once you develop the confidence, it is a very large country. It will still take 25, 30 years. We are well on the way. So in that sense, I'm very, very optimistic about where India will head. What I'm not optimistic about, as we were discussing earlier, which is a big topic by itself on its own, is how the global situation will evolve. And that may not be favorable. So India's biggest risk today is what is happening outside
outside
India,
India.
not inside.
Okay.
So,
Well, I think we're going to have to do a full separate discussion because we were speaking a while about these various economic cycles that all seem to be lining up to 2030. Let's not get into that
Yeah,
right now.
yeah.
But, this has been so interesting. Really went to some places I did not expect us to touch
Expected.
on, but that's what I love about these conversations sometimes. So thank you, Mr. Joshi. Thank you so much for being here. I know you have to get going. Thank you everyone for watching. Mr. Joshi, his book is out. We're going to put a link to the book and his 2 articles. I highly suggest you go read them. Please read about these cases. Read about something till your information becomes knowledge, guys. Okay?
thank you.
And I think
Rohan.
if that one of the many things I have learned from this discussion, please like this episode, subscribe to this channel. Let us know in the comments what you think. I think this has like 100 discussion points that we could discuss further. We would love to have Mr. Joshi back on when he has some time on his hands again. Thank you everyone for watching. This is The Overcorrection. I'm Rohan Paranjpe. Cut.